Okay, thank you very much to the Sri Lankan Army for inviting me to speak with you here today. As indicated by the title of the session here at the moment, the role of regional organizations in CVE has become increasingly important over the last decade, as we've steadily grasped the complexity of contemporary forms of violent extremism. Terrorism is diverse, it's dispersed, and usually involves a fluid network of individuals and groups circulating ideas and establishing relationships across national borders. In this context, local and global security issues have largely become conflated and interdependent, requiring new international responses that have increasingly included institutions on the regional level, in Europe, in West Asia, and elsewhere. Now, despite the reference to MENA and the Americans in the presentation title, I'll be confining my analysis to the European Union in the interest of time. This is not only because we at the Royal United Services Institute have experienced partnering with the EU on some of its various CVE projects, but as one of the largest humanitarian aid donors in the world, the EU is often considered to be at the forefront of both development and now increasingly countering violent extremism. By understanding the achievements and issues evident in the EU case study, an organization with uncommonly deep levels of centralization, political integration, and economic power, we can then begin to extrapolate out to analyze and understand the role of regional organizations operating in this space more broadly in other parts of the world. So I'll briefly outline how regional organizations integrate into global approaches to CVE, before describing the role and impact of the EU and the challenges facing European regional organizations when operating in the CVE space. I'll then summarize the implications and what this means for the agency of regional actors more broadly. So, in 2016, as we've heard, the UN released its Plan of Action for Preventing Violent Extremism, a global framework emphasizing the limitations of solely relying on traditional hard counterterrorism responses to stem the proliferation of violent extremism. Radicalization is, by its very nature, a fluid, non-linear, and individualized process, impacting different people in different ways in different contexts. So given this complexity, the UN highlighted the need to preemptively address the enabling conditions and drivers that foster violent extremism, using holistic, whole-of-society approaches that remain sensitive to local cultures, norms, and values, and are primarily led and designed by local communities. It therefore advocated the creation of a series of national plans of action by its member states that should, in theory, align with international law, but prioritize national and sub-national ownership and context-specific CVE programming. Now, despite the enthusiasm that's accompanied national plans of action across various different policy circles, many of these plans are not yet fully operational, and some of those that are have experienced a number of limitations, including a lack of adequate funding, a lack of proper implementation, and in certain instances it's clear that CVE has been used to curtail political dialogue and to co-opt elements of civil society. There are also limits as to how far national and sub-national programs have effectively tackled the transnational causes of violent extremism that often accompany more localized drivers. And this remains an ongoing concern. The UN therefore recognized that national and global action needs to be complemented by enhanced regional cooperation, and it highlighted two main roles for regional organizations in this respect. They would serve as arenas to exploit comparative advantage and facilitate international cooperation. And secondly, they would act as hubs to provide technical assistance and build the capacity of national and sub-national actors in delivering CVE. So this essentially underpins our current thinking about the role of regional organizations in the CVE space and provides the context in which the EU is now operating. So turning to the European Union specifically, Brussels is often considered to be a model for a regional agency in the CVE space and has had many of its faculties, both in terms of its prevention work, but also in terms of political cooperation more broadly, being adapted and replicated by other regional organizations, including the African Union. Identifying terrorism as one of the critical threats facing Europe most recently in its 2016 Global Strategy for Foreign and Security Policy, the EU has consistently highlighted the need and the importance of integrating CVE objectives into both its internal policies within the European neighbourhood and its external assistance programming in other geographic areas, including the Middle East and the Horn of Africa. Now, given the prominence of foreign fighters migrating to Syria and Iraq, the prospect of increasing numbers of returnees embedding themselves in European societies as the so-called Islamic State continues to contract, and the resurgent rate of local terrorist attacks in countries like France, Belgium, and most recently Spain, the interdependence between CVE activities within and outside Europe is now at the forefront of the EU's understanding and conduct of its prevention work. Now, despite undergoing a number of subsequent revisions, the key elements of the EU's approach to CVE are outlined in its 2005 counterterrorism strategy, which described 4 key pillars: respond, protect, and pursue, which constitute more conventional counterterrorism approaches, and the prevent pillar, or in other words, CVE. With its basis in the EU strategy for combating radicalization and recruitment to terrorism, the prevent pillar identifies a number of priority areas for EU action, both within and outside Europe, including the promotion of security, justice, and equal opportunities for all, the need for community engagement, the importance of counter-narratives, and the importance of capacity building for frontline CVE practitioners across a range of relevant sectors. It also encourages collaboration between a range of stakeholders, including governments, civil society, and the private sector, and works to complement and reinforce autonomous national-level CVE approaches to building community resilience that are currently being conducted by EU member states themselves, including Denmark, Germany, and the UK with its Prevent scheme. The EU's Prevent pillar also emphasizes the multidisciplinary nature of CVE, promoting an integrated approach that crosses a range of different policy areas, including development and education, all the way through to conflict resolution and law enforcement. So given the breadth of this activity, the EU therefore engages with CVE in many different ways. And some of these activities and projects will be explored in a bit more detail later. But broadly speaking, its activities include raising public awareness to radicalization and the threats it poses, sponsoring interventions to protect vulnerable communities and individuals through, for example, sponsoring education and reintegration schemes, and for building the CVE capabilities of relevant governmental and non-governmental actors. This diversity is also reflected in the range of mechanisms used to fund and coordinate CVE capabilities, which draw on a range of European thematic and geographic instruments, including the European Development Fund and the instrument contributing to stability and peace for activities outside Europe, and Horizon 2020 and Erasmus Plus for CVE activities inside Europe. So against this backdrop, the role of the EU should be defined by the added value it brings to CVE, and this has been evident on both a technical and normative level. So primarily with over 140 delegations worldwide, the European Union has helped facilitate European cooperation and promote international partnerships for CVE policy and programming.
Michael, you've got to hurry up, 2 minutes.
2 minutes, oh my gosh, okay, time's going. So this has been essential for helping share information, ideas, and experience between member states to collectively help build CVE best practice and to help coordinate cross-border collaboration to address the transnational drivers and symptoms of violent extremism inside and outside Europe. It's also helped with vertical integration, aligning the national and subnational CVE approaches of European member states with international strategies like the UN Global Framework to avoid duplication and to help deliver a common approach to countering terrorist recruitment. It's also helped facilitate horizontal communication between civil society actors, and a good example of this is the Radicalization Awareness Network, which offers a clear example of a platform facilitating over 2,000 European frontline CVE practitioners to help share their knowledge, peer review each other's practices, pool their expertise, and act as a force multiplier for tackling radicalization across different contexts both inside and outside Europe. Crucially, the EU has also helped advocate and push back against regressive trends now encroaching on CVE, particularly the impulsion of governments recently to prioritize law enforcement and security approaches to tackling violent extremism and a particular sort of exclusive focus on Islamic extremism. By contrast, the EU offers a strong, substantial voice for helping conserve the otherwise fragile gains we've made in the CVE space, emphasizing the need to pursue a holistic, whole-of-society approach designed and led by local communities, and by recognizing the importance of addressing other forms of violent extremism beyond its Islamic iterations. Beyond helping to strengthen national capabilities and providing stopgap measures across a range of different contexts, the EU, crucially, also helps in cultivating the necessary space and investment for experimentation and innovation in the CVE space. Given the limited knowledge base and lack of empirical data that often characterizes CVE programming, practice, and research, funding mechanisms like Horizon 2020 and experimental programs like Strive are critical for moving our understanding and proficiency of CVE forward.
Michael, we'll have to wind up.
Okay, so unfortunately time has escaped me, but to conclude, it's clear that regional organizations cannot provide a substitute for nationally owned CVE efforts, even in the case of an affluent body like the European Union. However, they do play essential roles in supplementing and strengthening these national and subnational efforts, providing a range of services that have the capacity to scale up and consolidate CVE activities in contexts often characterized by a lack of national leadership. It's also important to recognize the role of regional organizations will continue to change over time, and it is essential these organizations reflect the shifting demands of a fast-evolving policy space if they're to preserve their relevance and continue to add value in countering violent extremism in the future. Thank you very much.